Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I want to start a little differently. Usually, when I begin a video, I jump right into the topic. But today, I need to tell you about the night I received this story first. It was a Wednesday evening. Around 11 o'clock, I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking tea, getting ready for bed. My phone buzzed. A new email. I almost left it for the morning, but for some reason, my hand reached over and opened it anyway. The sender signed her name, MS, 67 years old, New York. The very first line she wrote was, "I don't know why I'm sending this to you. Maybe because I need someone to tell my story. Not so people will feel sorry for me, but so others won't make the same mistakes I did." I finished reading that email at almost 1 in the morning, and I just sat there at my kitchen table for a long time, not doing anything. Because there are some stories. When you finish reading them, you can't just nod and move on. You have to stop. You have to ask yourself, am I doing something like this to someone in my own life? The story I'm about to share with you today, this is a true story. I reached back out to her, asked for her permission to share it, and she agreed on one condition. Don't make me the hero. I made mistakes too, just in a different way. I promised her that, and I'm making that same promise to you. This is not a story about a perfect mother and an ungrateful child. This is a story about love, real love, and the price we sometimes pay when we love without boundaries. Her name is Cecile. Cecile Sullivan. She's 67 years old. And this is her story. December 24th. The penthouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan had been filled with the smell of roasting turkey since early morning. Cecile had been awake since 5:30. Not because she couldn't sleep, but because she wanted everything to be perfect. The apple pie had to come out of the oven before 9. The gravy needed at least 4 hours to simmer. The crystal glasses had to be polished until the lights from the Christmas tree reflected inside them like tiny stars. This was a tradition she had kept since Thomas was still alive. Christmas was always about family, about meals made by hand, about conversations that stretched long past midnight. 25 people were coming tonight. Relatives, friends of Daniel's, colleagues of Brooks. Cecile had made the list 2 weeks in advance. She knew who was allergic to what, who couldn't eat gluten, who preferred red wine over white. She stood by the kitchen counter, her apron stained with gravy, her hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her hands, the hands that had signed hundreds of real estate contracts, that had painted the walls of their first apartment back in 1995, that had held Thomas's hand in the emergency room the night he left this world, trembled slightly as she carried a heavy serving tray from the kitchen to the dining table. "Cecile, come sit down," her cousin Sarah said, her voice carrying that particular mix of concern and pity that Cecile knew so well. "You've done enough. Let someone else handle it." "I'm fine," Cecile smiled. "You go ahead and sit. Don't worry about me." That was the sentence she had been saying for the past 3 years. "I'm fine. Don't worry about me." From her spot by the kitchen counter, Cecile could see the entire dining room. The long table was covered with a white tablecloth, set with fine china, and the crystal glasses she had bought when she and Thomas were young. White tapered candles burned at the center. Through the large floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered in the Christmas night, millions of lights stretching all the way to the horizon. This was a 2,000-square-foot penthouse on East 70th Street. 7th floor. Market rent, $3,800 a month. Daniel, her son, was paying $1,400. Sitting at the head of the table in a white linen shirt and the Rolex that Brooke had given him for his birthday last year, Daniel was talking to his cousin Alex. His hands moved with his words, animated and confident. "This month has been absolutely insane," Daniel was saying, his voice carrying that easy excitement of a man who believed the world was going exactly as it should. "The client keeps pushing the deadlines. But hey, the salary for a senior architect in New York is nothing to complain about. It's enough to keep this place." He gestured broadly at the penthouse around him. "The car, everything. If you're going to live in this city, you might as well live right." Alex nodded, visibly impressed. Brooke sat beside Daniel. Her red dress fitted perfectly, her manicured nails catching the candlelight as she rested her hand on her husband's arm. But the bills never stop coming, Brooke said, raising her voice just enough so the whole table could hear. This apartment, the decorations, keeping up with the lifestyle, nothing is cheap in New York. No matter how much you make, it goes. Several heads around the table nodded in agreement. Uncle George cleared his throat. That's the truth. Rent in this neighborhood is at least $2,500 a month for something decent. It's brutal. Exactly, Daniel said, sitting up straighter. That's why I always say, you have to work for it. Nobody gives you anything for free in this city. If you want to live well, you have to earn it. Cecile was carrying the turkey platter to the table. She heard every word. Her hands tightened around the platters but her smile didn't change. Nobody looked at her. Nobody noticed. The dinner had reached dessert. Cecile had just brought out the apple pie when Daniel set down his wineglass and looked directly at her. There was something in his eyes she recognized immediately. It was the same look Thomas used to get when he had made up his mind about something important, firm, certain, not open for discussion. But this time, that look brought nothing good with it. Mom, Daniel said, and his voice cut through every conversation at the table at once. 25 pairs of eyes turned toward Cecile. Since we're already talking about the house and expenses, he continued, placing his hands flat on the table, I've been thinking about something. If you want to keep living here with us, you should be contributing to the rent, like any adult who shares a space with other people. The room went completely still. It's only fair, right? He added, glancing around the table as if looking for someone to back him up. We're all adults here, and if that's difficult for you with your widow's pension, well, maybe it would make more sense for you to find somewhere more in line with what you can actually afford. Brooke took a slow sip of her wine and nodded. Especially because we're family, she said. That's exactly why we should be honest about these things. Cecile looked around the table. Sarah was staring at her plate. Uncle George coughed quietly and reached for his fork. A few guests gave small nods, the kind that said that sounds reasonable. Aunt Patricia murmured something about how everyone needed to be more independent these days. Not one person spoke up. Not one person said, how can you talk to your mother like that? Not one person asked, are you really telling your mother to pay rent on Christmas? The silence was so complete that Cecile caught the clock ticking on the kitchen wall. She stood there, and it felt as though 28 years of sacrifice, of sleepless nights, of counting every dollar, of building something from nothing so her son could have a future, were evaporating into the air-conditioned air of this penthouse. Then, slowly she set the serving spoon down on the counter. She folded her napkin and placed it next to her untouched plate. She stood up, her knees creaking slightly the way they always did now. Thank you all for coming, she said, in a voice so calm it surprised even her. This Christmas dinner will probably be the last one I spend in this house. Daniel blinked. Mom, you don't have to be so dramatic. We're just having a realistic conversation about. You're right, Daniel, she said, interrupting him quietly, looking straight into his eyes. It's time to be realistic. She turned and walked down the hallway toward her bedroom. Behind her, she heard the uncomfortable shuffling of chairs, a few murmured exchanges, and then someone trying to restart the conversation with a cheerful, so, who wants a slice of pie? She closed her bedroom door. The click of the latch was small, but inside her head, it sounded like the closing of a chapter. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. On the nightstand were 2 framed photographs. The first one, Thomas and her, on the day they cut the ribbon at their first building in Chelsea. She was 34, wearing a simple floral dress, her hair pulled back. Thomas was holding the ceremonial scissors, grinning. Behind them stood a modest 4-story building, their first dream made real. The second, Daniel at 6 years old, handing Thomas a small hammer during the weekend. They all spent together renovating their first apartment. His little face was so serious, so focused, like he understood exactly how important the work was. Cecile opened the nightstand drawer. Inside was a manila envelope, documents that no one in this house knew existed. But she didn't open it. Not yet. She went to the closet and pulled out an old suitcase. Dust lifted when she opened it. Inside, still attached to the handle, was a luggage tag from a trip to Boston that she and Thomas had planned together, a trip they never got to take. She began folding her clothes. There wasn't much. 3 blouses, 2 pairs of slacks, a sweater, underwear, her comfortable shoes. Everything fit neatly into half the suitcase. She paused in front of the closet mirror. A 67-year-old woman looked back at her, silver hair pulled back, lines at the corners of her eyes, hands that showed every year of work they had done. She had spent nearly 40 years building something that mattered, and for the last 3, she had allowed her son to walk all over that legacy while she served dinner in silence. Why did I let this happen? She zipped the suitcase closed. The sound was final. She picked up her purse, tucked in her wallet, her phone, and the keys to her real apartment, the one in the Upper West Side that Daniel had never seen. Then she opened the bedroom door. The sound of music and laughter drifted in from the dining room. They had resumed the party. They probably assumed she was crying in her room, that by morning she'd come out apologizing for making a scene and ruining everyone's Christmas. Cecile pulled the suitcase down the hallway. The wheels on the hardwood floor made a sharp, clean sound, like a blade cutting straight through the Christmas music playing in the other room. The laughter stopped. 25 heads turned. Brooke was the first to speak, her voice carrying that familiar tone that always managed to be condescending while pretending to be reasonable. "Cecil, don't be dramatic. Nobody is kicking you out. We're just having an adult conversation about responsibility." Cecil looked at her daughter-in-law steadily. "You're right, Brooke," she said. "It's time for all of us to be responsible adults." Daniel pushed back his chair and stood. His cheeks were slightly flushed from the wine. "Mom, I didn't mean for you to leave tonight. I just wanted you to understand that." "I understand perfectly," Cecile said. "You believe this house is yours, that the car is yours, that everything you have is because of your own hard work." She paused. "I understand that." Brooke stepped forward. "Daniel works incredibly hard. He's up early. He stays late. Nobody handed him anything." Cecile looked at her for a long moment. There was so much she could have said. She could have taken the manila envelope out right then and there. She could have laid every document on the table and let them read for themselves. But she didn't. Because the best lessons don't come from words. They come from consequences. "You're right," she said simply. "No one gives anything away for free." She opened the front door of the penthouse. "Mom, at least let me know where you're going. Let me call you a car." "I already have one," she said without turning around. "When I need to be in touch, I will be." The door closed behind her. The hallway was quiet, lit by the cold white glow of LED lights. Cecile pulled her suitcase toward the elevator. She didn't look back. She didn't cry. She breathed. For the first time in 3 years, she breathed, without the weight of a lie sitting on her chest. The elevator opened on the ground floor. George, the night doorman, looked up from his desk. He had worked in this building for 8 years. He knew Cecile, not just as Mr. Sullivan's mother, but because every single time she passed through that lobby, she stopped and asked how he was doing. By name. "Miss Sullivan?" He stood, looking at the suitcase with concern. "Leaving at this hour?" "George," she said, stopping beside his desk. "I need to ask you a small favor." "Of course, ma'am. Anything." "In the next few days, some people from a property management company will come to pick up the gray Cadillac in Space 7. They'll have authorization from the company. Please let them through." George blinked, clearly puzzled, but nodded without question. "Yes, ma'am, as you say." Outside, a black Lincoln Town car was waiting at the curb. Not a taxi. It was a Sullivan and Hayes Properties vehicle, driven by Mike, one of the employees Cecile had trusted for years. "Good evening, Miss Sullivan," Mike said, taking her suitcase without being asked. "Upper West Side apartment?" "Yes, Mike, thank you." She settled into the back seat. The door closed softly. Christmas night New York moved past the window. Lit up streets. Tourists out even in the cold. Storefronts dark, but still glowing with their holiday displays. This city. Her city. She had built her place in it dollar by dollar. Brick by brick, contract by contract. And somewhere along the way, she had made herself invisible in her own story. The car turned onto Broadway, heading toward the Upper West Side. Cecile looked out the window. And for the first time in 3 years, she did not feel like anyone's burden. That night, Cecile sat on the couch of her Upper West Side apartment for a long time without turning on the lights. The place smelled the way it always did when she hadn't been here in a while. A little closed up, a little still, like a room that had been holding its breath. 850 square feet. No doorman, no view of the skyline. A second-hand lamp in the corner. A small kitchen. Bookshelves along one wall, filled with the kind of books she actually read rather than displayed. This was where she came to think, to work without being interrupted. To simply be Cecile Sullivan, businesswoman, instead of Cecile, the widowed mother living off her son's generosity. She opened her laptop. The Sullivan and Hayes Properties Management System loaded slowly. She clicked on the folder marked Daniel Sullivan, Assigned Assets. A list appeared on the screen. Lease agreement, East 70th Street, Unit 234. Expires January 31st. Assigned vehicle, Cadillac AE6. Temporary authorization. Additional credit card, $5,000 limit linked to primary account. She stared at the list for a long time. 3 clicks. That was all it would take to change her son's life completely. But before she made those calls, before she set anything into motion, she needed to sit with the full weight of how they had gotten here. Not just tonight. Not just Daniel's words at the dinner table. But all of it. The whole long road that had led to this moment. She closed the laptop, and she let herself go back. Thomas Sullivan had the kind of hands that told you everything about him before he ever said a word. They were big hands, calloused, permanently stained along the knuckles from years of construction work. The kind of hands that knew how to fix things, build things, hold things together when everything around them was falling apart. Cecile had noticed those hands before she noticed anything else about him. She was 19 years old, working as a house cleaner in rural Virginia. He was 22, a construction worker on a housing project 2 towns over. They met at a church potluck dinner on a Sunday afternoon in late September. He asked if he could sit across from her at the picnic table. She said yes. They talked until the sun went down and the other families had all gone home. 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony at that same church. The honeymoon was a weekend in Myrtle Beach, the only thing they could afford. They drove down on a Friday, stayed in a motel 2 blocks from the beach, ate seafood from a paper basket on the boardwalk, and drove home Sunday afternoon. It was the best weekend of Cecile's life. When Daniel was born, they were living in a 300-square-foot studio apartment in the Queensboro of New York City. Thomas worked construction 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Cecile did bookkeeping from home for small local businesses. 3, sometimes 4 clients at a time, with Daniel sleeping in a second-hand crib set up right beside her desk. Every dollar they earned went into a metal box hidden under the bed. Not a bank account, a metal box. Because a bank account felt too official, too permanent for money they were still afraid to trust. No vacations, no dinners out. Second-hand clothes from the church rummage sale. Homemade birthday cakes. Christmas gifts that were practical. Socks, a warm coat, a good pair of work boots. For 12 years, that was their life. 12 years of watching their neighbors move into bigger apartments while they stayed put. 12 years of Thomas coming home so tired, he fell asleep at the dinner table some nights. 12 years of Cecile doing the math over and over in a notebook, trying to find just a little more room in the budget, just a little more they could set aside. Daniel grew up in that studio. He slept in their bed until he was 7 because there simply wasn't space for anything else. And he never once complained. Not once. That boy, Thomas used to say, watching their son do his homework on the floor because they didn't have a proper desk. That boy is going to be something. In 1995, they finally had enough. $45,000. Every cent of it saved by hand over 12 years. They bought a 450 square foot apartment in the Chelsea neighborhood. The place was a wreck. Peeling wallpaper, a bathroom that hadn't been updated since the 1960s, a kitchen with one working burner. The previous owners had let it go completely. Thomas and Cecile renovated it themselves over 4 weekends. Thomas did the plumbing. Cecile painted every wall. Daniel, who was 6 years old, was put in charge of handing tools to his father, a job he took with the same seriousness he brought to everything. They rented it to a young couple for $400 a month. That $400 went into a new box, and then to another apartment, and then another. Thomas had a gift, a rare one. He could walk into a neglected building and see exactly what it could become. Not what it was, what it could be. He had an eye for structure, for light, for the bones of a space that most people couldn't see past the surface damage. Cecile had a different gift. She could make numbers tell a story. She could look at a balance sheet and understand not just where the money was, but where it wanted to go. She knew when to hold and when to move. She knew how to negotiate without making the other person feel beaten. Together, they were something neither of them could have been alone. By 2003, they owned their 5th building. Their lawyer, a quiet, careful man named Gerald, who had been handling their affairs since the 2nd property, sat them down one afternoon and said it was time to make things official. Time to create a proper corporate structure. Time to protect what they had built. Thomas had been watching a pair of sparrows on the electrical wires outside Gerald's office window the whole time the lawyer was talking. Sullivan and Hayes, Thomas said, when Gerald asked what they wanted to name the company. He nodded toward the window. Like those birds out there. Small. But they don't stop. They don't give up. And they always find their way home. Gerald looked at the window, then at Thomas, then wrote it down. Sullivan and Hayes Properties, LLC, was incorporated on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 2003. The 2008 financial crisis came like a wave that flattened everything in its path. Cecile remembered sitting at their kitchen table in October of that year, watching the news, listening to the numbers that kept getting worse. Property values collapsing. Foreclosures everywhere. People who had borrowed too much against homes they couldn't really afford, and now the whole house of cards was coming down. Thomas watched the television for a while. Then he turned it off. "We should buy," he said, as Cecile looked at him. "Everyone else is selling. That's why we should buy." She thought about it for 3 days. She ran the numbers 17 different ways. She called Gerald, who told her she was either going to be very right or very wrong, and that he genuinely couldn't tell her which. They bought buildings in Brooklyn, apartments in Soho, commercial spaces in the Upper East Side that people were practically giving away because nobody wanted to be holding real estate at the bottom of the worst market in decades. Thomas and Cecile wanted to be holding it. By 2015, Sullivan and Hayes Properties had 47 properties in its portfolio. Estimated value, $38 million. They kept working from the same small office they'd always used. A back room in one of their early Chelsea buildings. Nothing fancy, nothing that announced what they had become. Thomas still wore the same kind of work boots he'd worn on construction sites 30 years earlier. Cecile still drove the same sensible sedan she'd bought secondhand in 2009. They had agreed, without ever quite putting it into words, that they didn't want the money to change them. And they had agreed, with great deliberateness, after a long and serious conversation, that they didn't want it to change Daniel either. That conversation had happened on a Tuesday evening in the spring of 2010. Daniel was 15 years old. He was doing well in school, strong in math, passionate about drawing and design. Thomas had already started to see the architecture in him, the way the boy noticed the shapes of buildings when they drove through the city, the way he could look at a floor plan and immediately understand where the light would fall. Thomas and Cecile were sitting at their kitchen table after dinner, the way they did most evenings, going over paperwork, reviewing numbers, planning the next step. Thomas set down his pen. "We need to talk about Daniel," he said. Cecile looked up. She already knew what was coming. She had been carrying the same thought for months. "He's going to find out eventually," Thomas said. "The older he gets, the harder it'll be to keep this from him. And if he finds out on his own, that's worse." "I know," Cecile said. "So what do we do?" She was quiet for a while. Through the kitchen window, she could see the lights of the city. The same city they had spent 20 years quietly, steadily building a place in. "Do you remember the Harmon boy?" she finally said. "Charlie Harmon? From Daniel's 4th grade class?" Thomas thought for a moment. "The one whose father owned half of Westchester? That boy never worked for anything in his life," Cecile said. "Not because he was lazy. Because he never had to. His parents gave him everything before he ever learned to want it. Before he ever learned what it meant to earn something." Thomas was quiet, listening. "I don't want that for Daniel," she said. "I want him to know what it feels like to work for something and get it, to struggle and figure it out, to stand somewhere and know, I built this myself. We never got to hand that feeling to someone else. We had to find it on our own. And it's the most valuable thing we have." "So we don't tell him?" Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "Not yet," Cecile said. "Not until he's had time to build something of his own. Until he has enough of himself figured out that the money doesn't become the whole story." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "And if we wait too long?" he asked. Cecile looked at her husband. "Then that becomes our mistake to live with," she said quietly. "But I'd rather make that mistake than watch our son grow up believing the world owes him something." Thomas picked up his pen again. He turned it over in those big, calloused hands for a while. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "We wait." It was the most important decision they ever made together. And it was the decision that would, years later, cost them more than either of them had been willing to admit that night. Thomas Sullivan died on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November of 2017. He was sitting at his desk in their small office in Chelsea, reviewing a set of blueprints for a renovation project in Brooklyn, when he put his hand to his chest. "Cease," he said. That was all. The hospital said it was a massive heart attack. They said he hadn't suffered. They seemed to think this was a comfort. Cecile sat in the hallway outside the room where they had taken him, and she did not cry for a very long time. She just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the wall, and she thought about those sparrows he had watched from Gerald's office window 14 years earlier. Small, but they don't stop. And they always find their way home. She had Robert Hayes, Thomas's most trusted partner, the man whose name sat beside Sullivan's on the company letterhead, step into the role of executive director. She stayed in the background the way she always had. She came to the office. She reviewed every decision. She signed off on everything that mattered, but she let Robert be the face. She let him sit in the meetings, take the calls, shake the hands. Because after Thomas died, she found that she didn't want to be seen. She wanted to grieve quietly. She wanted to work. She wanted to keep building the thing they had built together, because it was the closest she could still get to him. What she didn't see, what she wouldn't understand until 3 years later, sitting in a Queens apartment going over credit card statements, was that grief had done something to her judgment. Grief had made her generous in all the wrong ways. Daniel had graduated from architecture school and landed a job at a respected mid-sized firm in Manhattan. His starting salary was $2,800 a month after taxes. Not bad for a young architect in New York, but not the kind of money that goes far in a city like that. He came to visit Cecile at the office one afternoon, about 8 months after Thomas died. He sat across from her small desk in the back room and told her he was ready to move out on his own. He'd found an apartment on the Upper East Side. A nice one, he said, but it was $2,200 a month, and with everything else, it was going to be tight. Cecile looked at her son. He had Thomas's eyes, that same steadiness, that same certainty. But there was still something young in him, something that hadn't yet learned the real weight of things. She opened the Sullivan and Hayes system on her computer. "We have an empty unit on East 70th Street, she told him. 2,000 square feet, renovated 2 years ago. Market value is $3,500 a month. Daniel's eyes went wide. "Mom, that's way out of my range." "I can offer you an internal rate," she said, $1,400 a month. It's a discount we extend to people connected to the company. Seriously? His whole face opened up. "But are you sure you don't need it for something else?" "I'm fine in my Chelsea apartment," she said. She said it easily, naturally, as though it were simply true. It wasn't. The Chelsea apartment was also hers. But he didn't know that. And in that moment, tired from months of grief, wanting more than anything to see her son light up the way he just had, she didn't correct herself. Daniel signed the lease that same week. The document read, Lessee Daniel Sullivan, Lesser, Sullivan and Hayes Properties LLC. He never asked who was behind Sullivan and Hayes. It simply didn't occur to him to ask. 2 months later, Brooke Hartwell appeared in his life, a lifestyle influencer with 50,000 Instagram followers, who decorated their spaces and captioned her posts things like, "My architect boyfriend has impeccable taste." When they got married the following year, Cecile quietly authorized an additional credit card linked to her personal account. "Just for emergencies," she told Daniel when she handed it to him. "In case something comes up." Something came up constantly. Dinner at an 11 Madison Park caliber restaurant. $847. A Louis Vuitton bag from the Fifth Avenue store. $3,400. A long weekend at a hotel in Miami. $2,200. The statements arrived every month. Cecile paid them in silence. She told herself she was helping, that she was making sure her son had a good life, that Thomas would have wanted this. But Robert Hayes had told her twice, quietly, carefully, the way he always raised difficult things, that this wasn't helping, that what she was doing was building a wall between Daniel and reality, one comfortable brick at a time. She hadn't listened. She understood now, sitting alone in her Upper West Side apartment on Christmas night, that Robert had been right. Silent love without limits isn't love. It's something closer to fear. The fear of being needed less, of being seen as less, of losing the one connection to a life that felt whole again. She had been afraid, and that fear had cost her son 3 years of living inside a story that wasn't true. She picked up her phone. It was 11:47 in the evening. Outside, fireworks from a private party somewhere in the neighborhood sent brief flares of color across the winter sky. She dialed Robert's number. He picked up on the second ring. "Cecile, Merry Christmas. Is everything all right?" "Robert," she said, looking at the photographs on the wall. Thomas at the Chelsea building, Thomas at the Brooklyn complex, Thomas everywhere she looked. "I need you to pull together all the documents related to Daniel first thing tomorrow morning. The lease agreement, the vehicle authorization, the credit card statement." A pause on the other end of the line. "Cecil, are you sure?" "Completely," she said. Another pause, longer this time. "All right," Robert said. "I'll have everything ready by 8. "Thank you, Robert." She hung up. Then she opened her laptop again and looked at the list on the screen. Lease agreement, vehicle, credit card, 3 items. 3 things that, one by one, were about to teach her son the lesson she and Thomas had always meant to give him, the one they had waited too long to deliver. She closed the laptop. She turned off the light, and for the first time in longer than she could endure, she slept without dreaming. December 27th, 2 days after Christmas. The Sullivan and Hayes Properties office occupied the 3rd floor of a modernist building on Park Avenue, situated between a high-end stationery shop and a luxury watch dealer. Most people walked past the building every day without giving it a second glance. There was nothing about the exterior that announced what was inside. Just a small brass plaque beside the entrance that read Sullivan and Hayes Properties, LLC, 3rd floor. That was how Cecile had always wanted it. She arrived at 8:30 in the morning. The receptionist, a young woman named Sophie, who had been with the company for 2 years, nearly knocked over her coffee when she looked up from her desk. "Miss Sullivan, we weren't expecting, good morning." "Good morning, Sophie. Is Robert in?" "Yes, ma'am. He came in about an hour ago. He's in his office." Cecile walked down the hallway. The walls were lined with photographs of the company's buildings. Every property they had ever developed or acquired, arranged in chronological order. The earliest ones were grainy, taken on a disposable camera at construction sites in the mid-90s. The later ones were professional glossy, the kind that ended up in real estate publications. She stopped in front of one near the middle of the wall. It had been taken in 2012, at the opening of a residential complex they had built in Brooklyn. Thomas was in the foreground, wearing his hard hat, grinning at the camera the way he always did at these things. Behind him, slightly out of focus, was a woman in a dark blazer, holding a folder and talking to 2 men in suits, who were clearly listening very carefully to what she was saying. Nobody who looked at that photograph ever asked who the woman in the background was. She knocked on Robert's door. "Come in." Robert Hayes was in his early 50s, with gray at his temples and the kind of careful, unhurried manner that made people trust him immediately. He had been Thomas's right hand for 15 years before Thomas died. He had become Cecile's after. When he saw her, he stood. "Cecile, please, sit down." She didn't sit right away. She went to the window first. From here you could see the full length of the avenue. Morning traffic backed up toward Midtown. A group of tourists studying a map on the corner. A woman in a red coat walking 4 dogs at once. Normal life. Continuing without interruption the way it always did. "Did you pull the documents?" she asked. "Everything's here." He opened a manila folder on his desk. "But before we go through it, I have to ask. Are you absolutely sure about this? Once we start, there's no quiet way to walk it back." Cecile turned from the window. "Robert," she said, "Thomas and I built this company in the background. We kept quiet about it because we believed in humility. We didn't want to be the kind of family that shows off what they have." She paused. "But at some point, my silence stopped being humility and started being a lie. A lie that let my son speak to me as if I were a burden in his own home." She finally sat down. "I should have corrected this a long time ago. This is me correcting it." Robert held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "All right." He slid the folder across the desk. "Linda's waiting in the conference room." Linda Cooper was 52 years old, with reading glasses she wore, pushed up on her head, and a reputation in New York real estate law for being thorough to the point of being difficult, which was exactly why Cecile had hired her after Thomas died. When Cecile walked into the conference room, Linda already had her laptop open and 3 legal reference books stacked beside it, each one bristling with yellow sticky notes. "Cecile." She stood and shook her hand firmly. "Robert gave me the overview. I'm sorry this is how your Christmas ended." "I don't need sympathy," Cecile said, sitting down. "I need options." Linda appreciated directness. She sat back down and pulled up a presentation on her laptop, turning the screen so Cecile could see it. 3 assets, Linda said. The residence, the vehicle, and the credit card. "Let's go through each one." She clicked to the first slide. "The lease on the East 70th Street unit expires January 31st. You have the legal right not to renew it. Under the residential tenancy terms in Daniel's contract, specifically Clause 12. 3. You simply need to send formal written notice 30 days in advance." She looked up. "Today is December 27th. That puts us right at the wire, but it's within the window. What if he refuses to vacate? Then we initiate eviction proceedings. But, Cecile, I don't think it'll come to that. When this notice arrives on company letterhead from a property management firm rather than from his mother, it will read very differently to him. It will feel like a business decision, because it is one. And if he tries to find out who owns the company, Linda allowed herself a small smile. Sullivan and Hayes is an LLC. Shareholder information is not public record. He would have to submit a formal request to the Secretary of State's corporate registry, which takes several weeks to process. By the time anything comes back, the 30 days will already be up. Cecil nodded. The vehicle. Straightforward, Linda said. The Cadillac has always been company property. Daniel's authorization was always temporary and explicitly revocable. We send a formal written request for the vehicle's return within 48 hours. If he doesn't comply, we send someone with a tow truck and the spare key set we keep on file. Send someone, Cecile said. Tomorrow morning. Give him tonight to read the lease letter first. Let him understand this is serious before the second thing arrives. Understood. And the credit card is the simplest of the three. It's an additional card on your personal account. One phone call to the bank. Effective within hours. Cecil looked at the 3 documents laid out in front of her on the conference table. Her son was going to lose his home, his car, and his unlimited access to money in the space of about 48 hours. Robert leaned forward from his chair along the wall. We could do this gradually, he said quietly. Space it out. Give him time to adjust between each one. No, Cecile said. Cecile. Gradual would be cruel, Robert. It would be like cutting off a finger every day instead of just taking the bandage off. She looked at the documents. He needs to feel the full weight of this at once. That's the only way it becomes real. There was a pause in the room. Then Linda said, in a voice that carried something that wasn't quite admiration but was closer to it. You're stronger than most people would be in this situation. I'm not strong, Cecile said. I'm a mother who let things go on too long and is finally doing something about it. She looked at Robert. Let's make the calls. The letter to the bank took 4 minutes. Linda dialed on speakerphone. A representative named Karen answered on the second ring, pulled up the account, and confirmed the additional card in Daniel Sullivan's name would be deactivated within 2 hours. Before they hung up, Cecile leaned toward the phone. I'd also like a full 12-month expense report for that card, please. Of course, Miss Sullivan. We'll have that emailed to you by end of business today. The lease non-renewal letter was drafted in the careful, neutral language of property management. Dear Mr. Sullivan and Hayes Properties, LLC, in its capacity as lessor of the property located at East 70th Street, Unit 234, hereby notifies you that the lease agreement, expiring January 31st, will not be renewed. The vehicle recall notice was shorter. Dear Mr. Sullivan, please be advised that the temporary authorization for use of the Cadillac Hay 6, license plate 482 KLM, property of Sullivan and Hayes Properties, LLC, is hereby revoked effective this date. We request the vehicle's return within 48 hours. Both letters went out by certified mail and email at 11:45 that morning. By noon, the credit card was deactivated. Cecile stood up, collected her coat from the back of her chair, and looked at Robert and Linda. Thank you both. I know this wasn't easy to be part of. Where will you be when all of this lands? Robert asked. My apartment. I'm not hiding from anything. If Daniel wants to find me, he knows where this office is. She buttoned her coat. But I'm not going to make it easy for him either. Not yet. She left the building at 11:58. The winter sun on Park Avenue was sharp and cold. A line of yellow cabs moved slowly uptown. A street vendor on the corner was selling roasted chestnuts from a cart, and the smell of them drifted across the sidewalk in the cold air, sweet and smoky, and oddly comforting. Cecile stopped in front of the Louis Vuitton window on her way to the subway. There, on the center mannequin, was a handbag she recognized immediately. She had seen it on an Instagram post 2 months ago. Brooke had posed with it in the penthouse living room, standing by the window with the Manhattan skyline behind her, and captioned it, "When your husband spoils you." The bag had gotten 4,000 likes. It had cost $2,634. The statement for that purchase was sitting in Cecile's email inbox right now. She looked at the bag in the window for a moment. Then she walked on. Daniel opened his laptop at the penthouse dining table the morning of December 28th. Brooke was still asleep. The night before, they had stayed up arguing until nearly 3 in the morning. About Cecile, about the scene at dinner, about what it meant and what to do about it. Brooke's position had been consistent. Your mother is being dramatic. She'll be back by tomorrow, apologizing for ruining Christmas. Daniel had been less certain. There was something about the way his mother had looked at him when she left, something behind her eyes that wasn't anger and wasn't sadness, was something steadier than either, that he hadn't been able to stop thinking about. He clicked on his inbox. Among the holiday newsletters and unread work emails, a subject line caught his eye. Formal knocker, lease agreement, non-renewal. Sender, Sullivan and Hayes Properties, Leasing Administration. His first thought was that it was spam, some kind of automated error. He opened it with a vague, unhurried curiosity of someone who was sure the whole thing would turn out to be nothing. He read the first line, then the second. Then he went back and read the whole thing 3 times, because his brain kept rejecting what the words were actually saying. Dot will not be renewed. Dot vacate the premises. Dot January 31st. His hands had gone cold. He found the phone number at the bottom of the letter and dialed it. It rang 4 times before a professional, unhurried female voice picked up. Sullivan and Hayes Properties, Leasing Department. How can I help you? Yes, hello. His voice came out tighter than he intended. My name is Daniel Sullivan. I just received a notice about my lease. There has to be some kind of mistake. I've always paid on time. I've never had any issues with the unit. One moment, Mr. Sullivan. Let me pull up your file. He heard the sound of typing. Each second felt longer than it should have. Mr. Sullivan, I don't see any error here. The owner has decided not to renew the lease on that unit. Under the terms of your agreement, this is within their legal rights. But why? Did I do something wrong? Is this about? He stopped himself. Can I speak directly with the owner? There must be some kind of misunderstanding. If I could just explain. I'm sorry, sir. Owner information on this account is confidential. If you'd like to appeal the decision, you can submit a written request to our office on Park Avenue. Park Avenue? Something about that address felt familiar, though he couldn't place why. What about when the unit becomes available again? He asked, hating how desperate he sounded. Could I reapply as a new tenant? Of course. When the property is relisted, you're welcome to apply like any other applicant. A pause. I should let you know, the current market rate for that unit is approximately $3,800 a month. Daniel felt the floor shift under him. 3,800, he repeated. Yes, sir. You've been on a preferential rate of 1,400, which will not carry over to a new lease. He sat there after the call ended, holding his phone, looking at nothing. $3,800 a month. His take-home salary was $2,800. The math wasn't just difficult. It was impossible. Brooke came out of the bedroom at 9:15, wrapped in the silk robe she'd ordered from a boutique in Soho last spring. Why are you just sitting there? She asked, moving toward the coffee maker. You look like someone died. We're being evicted, Daniel said. Brooke turned around slowly. We have to be out of this apartment by January 31st. She stared at him. That's not possible. You pay your rent. You have tenant rights. Not when the owner decides not to renew the lease. He turned the laptop toward her. Read it yourself. She read it. Her expression moved through confusion, then disbelief, then something harder. This is because of Christmas night, she said flatly. Your mother did this somehow. She got to whoever owns this building and... I don't know, Daniel said. He ran a hand through his hair. I don't know how she could have. but I'm going to find out. He reached for the Cadillac keys on the counter. I'm going to the Sullivan and Hayes office. I'm going to talk to someone face to face. What am I supposed to do while you're gone? Whatever you need to do, he said, already pulling on his jacket. I'll call you when I know something. He had never been to the Sullivan and Hayes office before. He knew the address from the lease paperwork. He'd seen it dozens of times without it meaning anything to him. But standing in front of the building on Park Avenue for the first time, looking up at the modernist facade with its tall windows and its small brass plaque, he felt a slow, strange unease settling in. He took the stairs to the third floor. At the reception desk, a young woman looked up. He gave her his name. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression, the smallest flicker of recognition or something like it. Before she stood and disappeared down a hallway to get someone, Daniel stood alone in the reception area and looked at the walls. Photographs of buildings. He recognized some of them. The Brooklyn complex he had driven past dozens of times, an office building in Soho he had walked by during lunch breaks. He had always assumed these were client projects, buildings the firm had managed or developed for someone else. Then he saw it. A large photograph near the center of the wall. A job site somewhere in Brooklyn, mid-construction, workers in hard hats in the background. And in the foreground, standing beside a half-built exterior wall, grinning at the camera with the ease of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be, was his father, Thomas Sullivan. Underneath the photograph, a small engraved plaque. Thomas Sullivan, co-founder, 1963 to 2017. In memoriam. Daniel stood very still. His father had been a construction worker, a laborer, a man who came home with his hands stained and his back aching and fell asleep at the dinner table some nights from the sheer exhaustion of the work. Co-founder. The word didn't fit. He turned it over in his mind, looking at his father's face in the photograph, trying to make it make sense. Mr. Sullivan. He turned. A man in his early 50s, silver at his temples, impeccably dressed, was walking toward him with his hand extended. I'm Robert Hayes, Executive Director of Sullivan and Hayes Properties. I understand you have some concerns about your lease agreement. Daniel shook his hand automatically, his eyes still moving between Robert's face and the photograph on the wall. That photograph, he said. My father, he worked here? Robert's expression shifted, something quiet and careful moving behind his eyes. Thomas was much more than an employee, he said. But that's a separate conversation. Why don't we go to my office and talk through your situation? Daniel followed him down the hallway, but his mind was already somewhere else entirely. Turning over the photograph, the plaque, the words, co-founder, and a dozen small things he had noticed over the years without ever stopping to ask about. The conversation in Robert's office lasted 20 minutes. Robert was polite. He was professional. He was genuinely sorry for Daniel's situation in the way that people can be sorry for something without being willing to change it. But he confirmed everything the letter had said. The lease would not be renewed. The market rate for the unit was $3,800 a month. There were other apartments in New York. He suggested Daniel begin looking soon because January was a competitive month in the rental market. He did not confirm who owned the company. He did not deny anything either. Daniel left the office at 12:40 and took the elevator back down to the lobby. On his way out, he passed the wall of photographs again. He stopped in front of his father's image one more time. And this time he noticed something he had missed before. In the background of the photograph, slightly out of focus, the way background figures always are, was a woman in a dark blazer, holding a folder, talking to two men in suits. The men were leaning toward her, listening. There was something about the way she stood, the angle of her shoulders, the way she held the folder, something familiar. He walked out onto Park Avenue and stood on the sidewalk in the cold, and he called Brooke. Did you find anything out? She asked immediately. Not yet, he said, but I think I need to look into this more carefully. Daniel, just call your mother. Whatever happened, she knows something about. I've called her 6 times since Christmas night. She's not picking up. A pause. Then go find her. He hung up and stood there a moment longer, looking up at the building. Sullivan and Hayes, his mother's last name, his father's last name, a company that had existed for, he did a quick calculation, nearly 20 years. And he had never once thought to ask about it. He was still standing on the sidewalk when his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He opened it. A message from Brooke sent from the store. Card declined. 3 times. Sullivan and Hayes card. Called the bank. They said it was canceled yesterday. By your mother. What is happening, Daniel? He read the message twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and started walking. He didn't have a destination in mind yet. He just needed to move. To think. The credit card. The lease. The car. He realized with a slow, sinking certainty that the car was next. That it was probably already in motion. He thought about his father's face on that wall. He thought about the woman in the background of the photograph. He thought about 100 small moments he had simply never examined. His mother, always knowing the exact market value of every building they drove past. His mother once mentioning, casually, something about a renovation project in Brooklyn, as if she knew it personally, then quickly changing the subject. His mother, who had supposedly been living modestly off a widow's pension, who wore the same navy coat she'd had for 5 years, who never talked about money except to say she had enough. He thought about the lease he had signed 3 years ago, which he had skimmed rather than read, because it had seemed like a formality. The document had been on Sullivan and Hayes' letterhead. He had noticed the name. He had thought it was simply the management company his mother had arranged things through. Some contact of his father's, maybe, someone doing a favor. He had never looked further than that. He stopped walking. He was standing in front of a coffee shop. He went inside, sat down at a corner table, and opened Google on his phone. He typed, Sullivan and Hayes Properties, New York. Owners. The search results loaded slowly on his phone screen. Sullivan and Hayes Properties, LLC. Real Estate Management and Development. Founded 2003. Executive Director, Robert Hayes. Portfolio, 47 properties across New York City and the surrounding metropolitan area. Estimated portfolio value, $38 million. Daniel read the number 3 times. 38 million. He scrolled down. There were press mentions, a brief item in a Brooklyn community paper about the C Towers residential complex opening in 2015. A short profile of Robert Hayes in a real estate trade publication. A handful of property records pulled from public databases. He clicked on the Images tab, photographs of buildings, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, construction sites. And then, in a group photo taken at the C Towers opening, he saw her. Not in the foreground. In the background, the way she always was. Standing slightly apart from the main group, in a dark blazer, talking to 2 men who were clearly listening to her carefully. The caption beneath the photo read, Robert Hayes, Executive Director of Sullivan and Hayes Properties, at the opening of the C Towers residential complex. A project developed by the Sullivan family. The Sullivan family. Daniel set his phone face down on the table. He sat there for a long moment, looking at the surface of the table, at the rings left by coffee cups, at the grain of the wood. Then he picked the phone back up and called Brooke. She answered before the first ring finished. Well, I think my mother owns Sullivan and Hayes Properties, he said. Silence on the other end. Daniel? I think she's owned it for 20 years. I think my father co-founded it with her. I think the apartment we've been living in is hers. The car is hers. The credit card is hers. He heard his own voice, as if from a slight distance, steady and strange. I think everything we have, everything I told everyone I had built, is hers. Another silence. Longer. The apartment on East 70th, Brooke said slowly. $3,800 a month. Yes. And you've been paying $1,400. Yes. And you told Alex at Christmas dinner that your salary was enough to keep the place, the car, everything. Her voice had gone very quiet. in the way that Brooke's voice went quiet when she was controlling something much larger underneath. You stood there and said nobody gives you anything for free in this city. Daniel didn't answer. And your mother, Brooke continued, was standing 6 feet away, carrying a serving tray, wearing an apron. He closed his eyes. Daniel, you told her to pay rent. In her own house. The words landed the way they were meant to. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't know. Brooke's voice shifted. Some of the hardness went out of it, replaced by something that was not quite sympathy, but was at least honest. But Daniel, did you ever ask? Did you ever actually look at the lease paperwork? Did you ever wonder, not even once, how a 2,000 square foot penthouse on the Upper East Side cost $1,400 a month? He didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, he hadn't wondered. He had accepted it the same way he had accepted everything else. With the easy, unexamined confidence of someone who had never had a real reason to question whether what he was receiving matched what he had earned. I have to go find someone, he said. Who? My grandmother. Eleanor was in room 304 at St. Luke's, recovering from a bout of pneumonia that had put her in the hospital 10 days before Christmas. Daniel had not visited her once since she was admitted. He had been too busy. Work deadlines, holiday preparations, the general forward momentum of a life that always had somewhere else to be. He had sent flowers. He had texted twice. He had not come. When he walked into room 304, Eleanor was sitting up in bed with a magazine open in her lap and reading glasses on. She looked smaller than he remembered. The way people sometimes look in hospital beds, diminished by the whiteness of the sheets and the blinking of monitors. But her eyes, when she looked up and saw him, were the same eyes they had always been, sharp, patient, seeing more than he would have liked. Daniel, she said. What a surprise. The words were simple. The tone beneath them was not. He walked over and bent down to kiss her cheek. Her skin was paper-thin and cool. She smelled like the lavender soap she had used for as long as he could remember. How are you feeling? He asked, sitting in the chair beside her bed. Better, the doctors say. I can go home in a few days. She studied him for a moment. You didn't come here to ask about my health. He looked at her. No, he admitted. I didn't. What happened? Sullivan and Hayes Properties, he said. I need you to tell me the truth about my mother. Eleanor closed the magazine slowly, set it on the bedside table, folded her hands in her lap. So you finally found out, she said. It was not a question. I'm starting to, he said. I want to hear all of it, from someone who was there. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't hesitation but was gathering. I was there, from the beginning, she said finally. I watched your mother and father save every single dollar for 12 years. I watched them buy that first apartment in Chelsea and renovate it themselves over 4 weekends. I watched them build that company brick by brick, property by property, through the years when nobody was watching and nobody was paying attention. She paused. I watched your mother run that company almost entirely alone after your father died, while everyone around her assumed she was a widow living off her pension. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Why did they never tell me? Eleanor looked at him steadily. Because they made a choice. A deliberate, considered choice when you were 15 years old. Your father wanted you to build something of your own before you knew about what they had built. He didn't want the money to be the answer before you'd had the chance to find your own questions. She paused. Your mother agreed. It was their decision together. But they lied to me. They didn't lie to you, Eleanor said, and there was a firmness in her voice that reminded him suddenly of his father. They chose not to tell you everything. That is not the same thing. Your mother arranged for you to have advantages. Yes, but she structured those advantages so you couldn't see them clearly, so you would have to work and struggle and figure things out. She was trying to give you the experience of earning your life, even while quietly making parts of it easier. It didn't work, Daniel said. No, Eleanor agreed. It didn't, because she made a mistake. a significant one. She looked at him directly. You want to know your mother's real error? It wasn't keeping the secret. It was keeping the secret while also giving you too much. She wanted you to feel independent, but she also couldn't stop herself from making things comfortable. She wanted you to struggle, but she couldn't quite let you struggle enough. Eleanor's voice was quiet but precise. That contradiction is what produced the man who stood up at Christmas dinner and told his mother to pay rent in her own house. The words sat in the room between them for a moment. She should have told me sooner, Daniel said, finally. Yes, Eleanor said, simply. She should have, and she knows it. I've told her so myself, more than once. She reached over and put her hand on top of his, thin and light, but warm. But Daniel, she made one mistake. You made many. And the question now isn't who was more wrong. The question is what you do from here. He looked at his grandmother's hand on top of his. I don't know where she is, he said. She won't answer her phone. I went to the Chelsea apartment she always talked about, and the doorman said a young couple has lived there for 2 years. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. That apartment was never hers either. He absorbed that quietly. She has a place on the Upper West Side, Eleanor continued. I've been there once. It's modest, nothing like what she could afford. She goes there to think. She paused. But Daniel, I wouldn't go looking for her yet. She's not hiding from you. She's waiting. There's a difference. Waiting for what? Eleanor looked at him with the patience of someone who had watched 2 generations of the same family make the same kinds of mistakes. For you to become someone worth finding, she said gently. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think this is the most important part of the whole story. Not the penthouse. Not the credit card. Not even the Christmas dinner. This conversation, right here. Because Eleanor says something that I've been thinking about ever since I read Cecile's email for the first time at 1 a.m. in my kitchen. She says, your mother made one mistake. You made many, and I think that's exactly right. And I think it's worth sitting with for a minute. Cecile's mistake was a real one. She wanted her son to be independent, but she also couldn't stop cushioning him from the consequences of not being independent. She wanted him to build his own life, but she kept quietly building it for him. That contradiction, that's not wisdom. That's love getting in its own way. And I know many of you watching this have been in some version of that position, maybe not with a real estate empire, but with your children, your grandchildren, the people you love most. The instinct to protect, to smooth the path, to make things easier. It's one of the most natural things in the world. And sometimes it backfires in exactly this way. But here's what I keep coming back to. Cecile's mistake was made out of love, even if it was love that had gotten confused. Daniel's mistakes were made out of something else, out of the ease of never having been asked to look too closely at what he was receiving, out of the comfort of a story that made him sound impressive at dinner parties. He never asked where the deal on the apartment came from. He never questioned the car. He never looked at the credit card statement and thought, wait, where is this money actually coming from? Who is actually paying for this? He just accepted it. And then he went and told a room full of people that nobody had given him anything for free. That's not just ingratitude. That's a kind of blindness that comfort produces in people. And it's one of the most important things for all of us to watch for. In ourselves, in the people we love. Because comfort without accountability doesn't build character. It just builds a longer distance to fall. All right. Let's go back to Daniel. The Cadillac was gone by the next morning. 2 men from the Sullivan and Hayes asset recovery team arrived at 8:15 on December 29th, while Brooke was still asleep and Daniel was standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee he hadn't been able to drink. They had clipboards, authorization paperwork, and the spare key. They were professional and they were sorry and they were firm. Daniel handed over the keys without arguing. He stood in the building entrances and watched the gray Cadillac back out of parking space 7 for the last time. and he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not even grief, exactly, more like clarity. Because the car was gone, and it had never been his. The apartment had a deadline now, and it had never been his either. The credit card was canceled, and it had been his mother's account all along. And the life he had described to Alex at the Christmas dinner table, the salary that covered everything, the man who had made it on his own in New York City, that had never been real. What was left? When you took all of that away? Him. Just him. $2,800 a month after taxes. A wardrobe full of clothes he'd bought on someone else's card. And a marriage that was already fracturing along fault lines he was only now beginning to see clearly. Brooke appeared in the doorway behind him. "They took it," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I called my parents last night." He looked at her. "I need some time to think, Daniel. About all of this. About us." Her voice was steady, not cold, but decided. "I'm going to go stay with them in Miami for a while." "Brooke, I'm not leaving you," she said. I need to think, and so do you. And we can't do that while we're both panicking about where we're going to live in 30 days and whose fault everything is." He wanted to argue. He wanted to say something that would fix it, the way he had always been able to fix things by talking, by being confident, by being charming, by being the man who had the right answer at the right moment. But he didn't have an answer this time. "Okay," he said. She nodded. She went inside to pack a bag. He stayed in the doorway, looking at the empty parking space. The apartment in Queens cost $850 a month. It was on the 8th floor of a building with no elevator, a buzzer system that worked only some of the time, and a superintendent named Mr. Yablonsky, who communicated primarily through handwritten notes taped to the mailboxes. The apartment itself was 450 square feet, the same size as the first apartment his parents had ever bought, though he didn't know that yet. The walls had water stains near the ceiling in the bedroom. The kitchen had a refrigerator from the early 1990s that hummed constantly. The bathroom had pink tile that was clearly original to whenever the building had last been renovated, which appeared to have been a very long time ago. Daniel moved in on January 30th, one day before the East 70th Street lease expired. With 2 suitcases, a sleeping bag, and a folding camp chair he had bought from a hardware store on Lexington Avenue, he slept on the floor that first night. He lay on top of the sleeping bag in the empty room and looked at the ceiling and did the math on his phone. Net monthly income after taxes, $2,800. Rent plus utilities, $920. Groceries, $300. Subway and bus, $60. Phone, internet, basic expenses, $120. Total, $1,400. Remaining, $1,400 a month. It was the most money he had ever actually controlled in his life, and it felt like nothing. He thought about the $847 dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant that appeared on his mother's credit card statement, a dinner he had taken a client to, a dinner he had described to Brooke afterward as a necessary business expense, a dinner that had felt entirely normal at the time. He thought about the $3,400 Louis Vuitton bag, the $2,200 hotel weekend, the $3,200 trip to Las Vegas for a friend's bachelor party. He thought about standing at the head of the Christmas dinner table and explaining to his cousin Alex that you had to work for what you had in this city, that nobody gave you anything for free. He turned off the flashlight on his phone. In the dark of his empty apartment in Queens, Daniel Sullivan was 35 years old, sleeping on a floor and understanding, for the first time in his adult life, the difference between having a life and building one. His neighbor knocked on his door 3 days after he moved in. She was in her late 70s, with white hair and the particular unhurried manner of someone who has long since stopped worrying about what other people think. She was holding a small container of soup. "I'm Dorothy," she said. "I live across the hall. I heard you moving in, and I thought, well, it sounded like not much was being moved." She held out the soup. "Tomato." Homemade, you look like you haven't had a hot meal in a few days. He hadn't. He had been eating peanut butter crackers and whatever came out of the vending machine in the lobby. Thank you, he said, taking the container. I'm Daniel. I know, she said. Mr. Yablonsky told me. Come for dinner on Sunday if you like. I'm making pot roast. He went. Dorothy's pot roast reminded him of something, in the way that food sometimes reminds you of something you can't quite name. Something warm and unconditional and very far back. He went back the following Sunday and the one after that. Dorothy had lived in the building for 22 years. She had been a school teacher. She had raised 2 daughters alone after her husband left. She had done it in this apartment on a teacher's salary, and she spoke about those years, not with bitterness, but with the calm, factual pride of someone who knows what they're made of. You remind me of someone I used to see on the subway, she told him. One evening, when he had brought over a bottle of wine and they were sitting at her small kitchen table after dinner. Years ago, a woman who always had rolls of blueprints under her arm. She always looked like she was carrying about 15 things at once. Folders, a briefcase, the blueprints. But she never looked overwhelmed. She just looked like she was getting on with it. Daniel looked up from his glass. What did she look like? Older, elegant, but simply dressed. No jewelry, no fuss. I once saw her arguing with 3 men in suits on the platform at 72nd Street. She had a blueprint unrolled and she was pointing at something on it, and the 3 of them were nodding like students. Dorothy smiled at the memory. She had your same jaw. Your same way of frowning when you're concentrating on something. Daniel was quiet for a moment. That might have been my mother, he said. Dorothy looked at him. Then she must be quite a woman, she said simply. He thought about his mother, not the version of her he had constructed in his mind over the years, the quiet, modest widow who needed to be taken care of. The real version. The version on the subway platform with the blueprints, making 3 men in suits nod like students. He had never looked for that version. He had never thought to. She is, he said. She really is. He sent her a message on a Tuesday evening in May, 4.5 months after Christmas. He had tried calling 47 times. Each call had gone unanswered. He had stopped counting at some point and simply kept trying, because stopping felt like giving up on something he needed not to give up on. This time, he wrote a message instead. Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to give anything back. I just want you to know that I'm starting to understand. Not just what you did, but why. And what I cost you by not seeing it sooner. I'm learning, slowly. But I'm learning. I love you. He sent it and put his phone face down on his second-hand kitchen table. 10 minutes later, it buzzed. He picked it up. The message was from Robert Hayes' number. Your mother received your message. She says she is well, and that she is proud you've found honest work. Keep going. When the time is right, she'll reach out. Daniel, read it 5 times. She is proud. He set the phone down on the table, and for the first time since Christmas night, he sat in his small, honest, entirely his own apartment in Queens, and he felt something he didn't have a precise word for, something that lived in the space between relief and grief and the very first, tentative edge of something that might eventually become hope. He didn't cry. He just sat with it. The refrigerator hummed in the next room. A siren passed on the street below. Somewhere down the hall, Dorothy was playing the radio low. He reached for his drafting pencil and opened his notebook to a blank page, and he started to draw. Frank Donovan's office was not what Daniel had expected. He had pictured something corporate. A proper reception area, framed credentials on the wall, the kind of office that announced its own importance. What he found instead was a converted warehouse space in a quiet part of Brooklyn, with exposed brick walls and mismatched desks, and 5 young architects working on laptops surrounded by scale models and hand-drawn sketches pinned to the walls like thoughts in progress. Frank himself was in his early 50s, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead and the slightly distracted energy of someone whose mind was always working on two things at once. He had contacted Daniel in February, 3 months after Christmas, 2 months into the Queen's apartment, through a message that said simply, "Your father worked on some of our early projects. I've seen your portfolio online. I think we should talk." Daniel had replied within the hour. They met on a Thursday afternoon. Frank made coffee in a French press and set it on the work table between them without ceremony. And then he talked about Thomas. "He was the best construction worker I ever had on a site," Frank said. "And I've had a lot. Most people, they see the plans and they build what's on the paper. Your father would look at the plans and then look at the actual space, the light, the ceiling height, the way the rooms connected. And he'd come find me and say, 'Frank, I think there's a better way to do this.' And he was right probably 70% of the time." He paused. "He told me once that buildings aren't for impressing people. They're for people to live in with dignity. I've never forgotten that." Daniel looked at the photograph Frank pointed to on the wall. His father, 20 years younger, grinning on a job site. The same grin from the Sullivan and Hayes wall. The same hard hat. "I didn't know you worked together," Daniel said. "For 3 years before he and your mother started the company." Frank looked at him directly. "I've followed Sullivan and Hayes from a distance ever since." Quietly impressive, what they built. Daniel nodded, not sure what to say. "I have a project," Frank said, moving on with the easy practicality of someone who respected other people's complicated feelings by not making too much of them. Housing renovation in Staten Island. Old industrial buildings that need to be converted into affordable apartments for working families. The budget is tight. The margin is thin. The pay I can offer you is $2,200 a month. It was $600 less than Daniel's current salary. "The work matters?" Frank added. "That's all I can promise you." Daniel thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. "When do I start?" Frank almost smiled. "Monday. Bring boots you don't mind ruining." The Staten Island project was nothing like the architecture Daniel had trained for. There were no clients in tailored suits reviewing renderings in glass-walled conference rooms. There were no presentations, no expense count lunches, no conversations about the materials chosen for their visual impact. There was a set of deteriorating industrial buildings on a patch of land that the city had effectively forgotten, a small team of workers who had been doing this kind of work their whole lives, and a daily reality of dust and structural surprises and problems that needed solving with whatever was actually available, rather than whatever the plans called for. Daniel wore through a pair of work boots in the first 6 weeks. He was on the site by 6:30 every morning, and rarely left before 5. He learned things architecture school had not taught him. How to read the actual behavior of an old building versus what the drawings said it should be doing. How to negotiate with suppliers who had heard every story. How to talk to the workers on his team in a way that made them want to solve problems with him rather than around him. He learned to cook out of pure necessity. Dorothy had given him her recipe for pot roast and a basic framework for about a dozen other things. And he discovered that feeding himself well on $300 a month was something that required real attention and actual skill. He started a small notebook of recipes the way he had always kept a notebook of architectural ideas. Small observations, adjustments, things that worked better than expected. He thought about his mother constantly, not with the guilt that had dominated the first weeks after Christmas, which had been acute and almost physical in its weight, but with something more complicated, with grinning, a growing, effortful of who she actually was. He would be on the subway and find himself replaying conversations they'd had over the years, hearing them differently now. He would be on the job site and think about Thomas's hands, those big, calloused, capable hands, and understand for the first time what it meant that his own father had worked like this, had chosen this, had seen dignity in it rather than limitation. He kept the notebook of drawings he had started the night he got Robert's message. By April, it had grown into something. The modular housing system had started as a rough sketch, a way to convert the Staten Island industrial buildings more efficiently, a structural approach that could be replicated across similar sites. But the more he worked on it, the more he refined it, the more he understood that it was actually something larger. A model, a template that could be applied across the city, in the Bronx, in parts of Queens, in sections of Brooklyn, where land sat unused and families were being pushed further and further from the places they had grown up in. He showed it to Frank on a Friday afternoon in early June, spreading the drawings across the work table. Frank looked at them for a long time without speaking. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked finally. "About 4 months." Frank picked up one of the drawings, set it down, picked up another. "The cost per unit," he said. $75,000. You're sure about that number? I've priced every component individually with 3 separate suppliers. There's an 8% contingency built in. I'm confident. Frank set the drawing down. "I know some people," he said. "Investors who care about social impact alongside return. I can't promise anything, but I think this is worth showing them." He looked up. "If I can get you a meeting, Daniel, you have to be flawless. This kind of opportunity doesn't repeat itself." "I understand." "Good." Frank picked up his coffee. "Give me a few weeks." The meeting Frank arranged was on Park Avenue. Daniel didn't know the specific address until 2 days before, when Frank texted it to him. He read it twice, and then he sat very still on the edge of his bed in the Queen's apartment for a moment. Park Avenue, the Sullivan and Hayes building. He called Frank immediately. "Is this right?" he asked. "This address." "It's right," Frank said. "Trust me, Daniel. Just go." He spent the 2 weeks between that call and the meeting preparing the most thorough presentation of his life. He worked on the Staten Island site during the day and at his kitchen at night, refining every number, anticipating every question, building the argument from the ground up the way his father had built things. From the structure outward, making sure the bones were sound before worrying about anything else. He bought a suit at a secondhand store on Junction Boulevard, a navy one, slightly large in the shoulders, $45. He had it taken in by a tailor 2 blocks from his apartment who charged him $12. He polished the shoes he had worn to every important occasion since his wedding. He printed 50 pages of drawings and analysis on the printer at the public library, paying $0, 15 cents a page. The morning of the meeting, Dorothy knocked on his door at 7:30 with a cup of coffee and a hard-boiled egg. "Go do something that matters today," she said, handing them to him. He thought she might be the kindest person he had encountered since Christmas. The Sullivan and Hayes building looked different this time. The last time he had stood in front of it, he had been frightened and confused, trying to hold on to something that was already gone. Now he stood on the sidewalk in his second-hand suit, with his worn briefcase and his 50 pages of work, and he felt something that was not confidence exactly. Confidence felt too easy, too close to the old version of himself, but was something more durable, a knowledge of what he had done to earn the right to be here. He went inside. The receptionist recognized him. She told him the meeting was in the 4th-floor boardroom and that they were expecting him. He hadn't known there was a 4th floor. The elevator panel had only shown 3 when he'd visited in December. He pressed 4. The doors opened onto a hallway he had never seen, glass-walled on one side, looking out over the avenue and, beyond it, the city stretching south toward the water. At the end of the hallway was a wooden door. A small plaque beside it read, "Boardroom, President's Office." He stood outside the door for a moment. He thought about his father watching sparrows from a lawyer's office window. He thought about a studio apartment in Queens with a metal box under the bed. He thought about 12 years of counting every dollar and what it had produced and what he had done with what it produced. He knocked. "Come in." He opened the door. She was sitting at the head of a long oak table in a gray pantsuit, her silver hair styled neatly. her hands clasped in front of her on the table. Beside her on the right sat Robert Hayes. On her left, Linda Cooper with a legal pad and a pen. And around the table, 3 other people Daniel didn't recognize, but who, from their folders and laptops and the way they held themselves, were clearly part of a serious executive team. Cecile Sullivan looked at her son across the length of the table. "Daniel," she said. Her voice was calm and professional, the voice of someone who had run meetings like this for 30 years. "Please sit down." He couldn't move for a moment. He hadn't seen her in 8 months. She looked like herself, but a version of herself he was only now equipped to actually see. Not the woman in the apron, not the widow who needed looking after, the woman with the blueprints on the subway platform, the woman in the background of every photograph. He started. "I am President Sullivan in this room," she said, without cruelty and without warmth, simply as a statement of fact. "And you are the architect Daniel Sullivan, who is here to present a social housing proposal to this investment committee. Is that correct?" He swallowed. "Yes," he said, "that's correct." "Then sit down and begin. You have 1 hour." He set up his laptop at the projector end of the table. The screen had a crack in one corner that he had tried to stabilize with a piece of electrical tape. While the system loaded, he was acutely aware of every person in the room, and of the distance between himself and his mother, and of the 8 months that lived inside that distance. Then the first slide appeared, and something settled in him. He had done the work. The work was real. Whatever else was happening in this room, whatever was unresolved and complicated, and years in the making, the work was real, and it was his. For the first time in his life, completely and without question, his. "Good morning," he said, and his voice came out steady. "My name is Daniel Sullivan. I'm a project architect specializing in adaptive reuse and social housing, and I'm here to present a proposal that I believe can provide dignified homes for 120 families in New York City." He clicked to the first slide, a photograph of the Staten Island site. Weeds pushing through cracked concrete, a collapsed section of roofline, faded graffiti on a wall that had once been a loading dock. "This is what our city looks like when it turns its back on a neighborhood," he said. "I've spent the last 18 months working on this site. I know every beam, every foundation issue, every problem this building has. And I can tell you with certainty, I also know exactly what it can become." He clicked to the next slide. For the next 45 minutes, Daniel walked them through everything. The modular conversion system and why it worked. The unit design, 500 square feet, optimized for natural light and livable space. The materials sourcing, the phased construction timeline, the cost per unit, broken down line by line with every supplier named and every contingency accounted for. He watched Cecile take notes. He watched Robert nod twice, almost imperceptibly, at points where the numbers were particularly solid. He watched Linda run figures on a calculator and write something down. When he reached the end of the financial section, one of the executives he didn't know, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped hair and the direct manner of someone who had seen many presentations, raised her hand. "The return margin is 6.7%, she said. "That's well below what most real estate investments in this market produce. We could put this capital into a residential development in Manhattan and see 25% returns. Why should we accept this instead?" Daniel looked at her. "Because this isn't just a real estate investment," he said. "New York City has a housing crisis that is getting worse every year. Families who have lived here for generations are being pushed out because the cost of staying has become impossible. This project won't make any of us rich, but it will let us sleep at night knowing that 120 families have a real home, not a shelter, not a substandard situation, but a genuine home. Because we chose to use our capital this way." He paused. "There are plenty of people who will take the 25%. I'm asking you to be the ones who took the 6.7. The woman wrote something down without expression. Cecile had not moved. Then she spoke. It was the first time in 45 minutes. Daniel. Her voice was the same quiet professional register it had been since he walked in. Everyone at the table stilled slightly. One personal question before we conclude, of course. Why this project? Why now? There are social housing proposals that cross investment desks in the city every month. What makes this one yours? What makes this one yours? The room was very quiet. Daniel looked at his mother across the length of the table. 8 months. A floor in Queens. 50 pages printed at 15 cents a page. Dorothy's pot roast. The Staten Island site at 6:30 in the morning with frost still on the ground. 47 unanswered phone calls. His father's face on the wall downstairs. Because 8 months ago, he said, I lost everything I thought I had. My home, my car, my marriage, and every story I had been telling myself about who I was and what I had built. His voice was steady. And in the process of losing all of that, I ended up in an apartment in Queens, where I had to figure out, for the first time in my adult life, how to actually live on what I actually earned. And my neighbors were families, good, working, decent people, paying $850 a month for 400 square feet in a building with no elevator and a superintendent who communicates through handwritten notes. He paused, and I understood something I should have understood a long time ago. That the people who most need dignified housing are exactly the people who have the least access to it. This project exists because I finally lived something close to what they live. And because my father, his voice caught, just slightly, because my father taught me, without ever sitting me down and explaining it, that the hands that build something matter more than the papers that sign off on it. He looked at Cecile. That's why this project. That's why now. Cecile held his gaze for a moment. Then she closed her notebook. Thank you, Daniel, she said. We'll have a decision for you within 48 hours. That will be all. He gathered his laptop, his papers, his worn briefcase. At the door, he paused. President Sullivan, he said. She looked up. Whatever you decide, thank you. For every lesson. Including the ones that hurt. He closed the door behind him. When the room had emptied of everyone, except Cecile, Robert, and Linda, Cecile remained seated at the head of the table for a long moment without speaking. Robert waited. Linda waited. Finally, Cecile said, Opinions. Robert spoke first. The proposal is sound. The numbers are realistic, and he knows them cold. The margin is thin, but it's honest. There's no inflation, no optimism built into the projections. The risk is real, but it's manageable. He paused. And whatever else is true about today, Cecile, the man who walked in here is not the man who was sitting at your Christmas dinner table. Linda nodded. Legally, everything is clean. Permits are achievable. The timeline is aggressive, but not unreasonable. She looked at Cecile over the top of her reading glasses. My only concern is conflict of interest. You're his mother. I'm aware of that, Cecile said. The committee should be aware of it too. If we approve this and it becomes known, if we approve this and it fails, it will be because the project failed, not because of who presented it. Cecile looked out the window. The Empire State Building was visible in the distance, caught in the afternoon light. Thomas always said that building something is an act of faith. You never know for certain it will stand until it does. She turned back to the table. We approve the project. Full investment, $9.6 million. Daniel will serve as project director, with monthly reporting to this committee, and strict financial oversight. He will have operational independence, but every significant expenditure is reviewed. She paused, and if he succeeds, we offer him a permanent position at Sullivan and Hayes, not as my son, as an architect who proved what he could do. Robert nodded slowly. And if he fails, Cecile looked at him. Then he will have failed honestly, she said. And that is worth more than any success he could have borrowed. The call came that same evening. Daniel was in his Queens apartment eating pasta he had made himself. Olive oil, garlic, a handful of cherry tomatoes, Parmesan he had grated from a block because the pre-grated kind was more expensive. When his phone rang, it was Robert. "The committee has made a decision," Robert said. Daniel set down his fork. "We're approving the project. Full funding. You'll receive the formal terms by email tonight." A brief pause. "Congratulations, Daniel. You did good work today." Daniel sat at his kitchen table for a long moment after the call ended. Mbawakten. Through the window, he could see the lights of his neighborhood coming on as the evening settled in. The laundromat across the street, the bodega on the corner, the windows of the apartment building opposite where people were making dinner and watching television and living their ordinary, daily, particular lives. He thought about calling his mother. He didn't. Not yet. It wasn't time yet. Instead, he picked up his fork and finished his pasta. Then he opened his notebook and began making a list of everything that needed to happen before Monday morning. He worked until midnight. He slept better than he had in months. 3 weeks after the approval, at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, Daniel's phone rang. He was already asleep. He had taken to going to bed early because the 6:30 site mornings had restructured his whole relationship with time, and the ringing pulled him up from a deep, dreamless sleep. He didn't recognize the number. "Hello? Is this Daniel Sullivan?" A woman's voice, professional, slightly urgent. "This is the nursing team at Mount Sinai Hospital. We're calling about your mother, Cecile Sullivan. She was admitted this evening with a cardiac episode. She's stable. I want to be clear about that. She is stable. But she's been asking for you." He was already sitting up, reaching for his shoes. "I'm on my way." The subway took 22 minutes. He ran the last 4 blocks from the station. Robert was in the hallway outside room 307 when Daniel arrived, looking tired in the way that people look when they have been keeping a vigil, without admitting to themselves that's what they're doing. "What happened?" Daniel said, reaching him. "Exhaustion, stress accumulation. The cardiologist says it's been building for a long time, years of 16-hour days, not enough rest, not enough of anything that wasn't work." Robert looked at him steadily. "It's not your fault, Daniel. I want to say that clearly. This didn't start at Christmas. But Christmas didn't help. Can I see her?" "She's awake. But keep it calm. She doesn't need emotion right now. She needs rest." Daniel pushed the door open gently. The room was dim, lit by the monitors and a single low light over the bed. Cecile was lying with her head, slightly elevated, connected to a heart monitor whose steady beeping was the most reassuring sound Daniel had ever heard. She looked smaller than he had ever seen her. Not diminished, just human. The particular human vulnerability of a 67-year-old woman who had been carrying too much for too long. "Mom," he said softly. She opened her eyes. The smallest smile crossed her face. Not performed, not managed, just real. "Hello, sweetheart," she said. Her voice was quieter than usual, but entirely clear. He crossed the room and took the chair beside the bed and took her hand. It was cool and light, the way hands get when the body is conserving itself. "What did you do?" he said, and his voice came out softer than he intended. "I think I forgot to stop," she said. "You have to stop sometimes." "I know that now." She looked at him. "Your presentation today. You don't have to talk about that right now." "I want to." Her hand tightened slightly on his. "Your father would have cried." "In the good way. The way he cried when we cut the ribbon on the Chelsea building." She paused. "He would have been so proud of you, Daniel." Daniel felt tears on his face before he was aware of crying. "I'm sorry," he said. "For Christmas. For every word. For 3 years for all of it." "I know," she said. "I know you are." She lifted her free hand and touched his face, the way she had when he was small and something had gone wrong and she was telling him without words that it was going to be all right. "I forgave you that same night. The night you left. What took time was waiting for you to be ready to do something with it. I don't deserve the project." "Stop," she said quietly. "Deserving isn't the point. Learning is the point. And you learned, Daniel. I saw it today. I've been seeing it in what Robert tells me every month about your work on the site. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. The project is yours. You earned it the right way, by doing the work, not by being my son. A doctor appeared in the doorway. Miss Sullivan needs to rest. You can come back in the morning. Daniel stood. He didn't let go of her hand right away. Mom. He looked at her. I have one question. Ask it. The Upper West Side apartment. The real one. Have you been all right there? On your own? She looked at him for a moment. And then she laughed. A real laugh. Quiet but genuine. The kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. Daniel, she said. I have been perfectly fine. I have been myself. That's all I needed to be. He squeezed her hand once. Get some sleep, he said. I'll be here in the morning. He walked out into the hallway. Robert was still there. They stood together for a moment without speaking. The way people stand together when the difficult part is over, and the next part hasn't started yet. She's going to be all right, Robert said. I know, Daniel said. He meant more than the hospital. He thought Robert understood that. They took the elevator down together and walked into the New York night, the city still going. The way it always was, indifferent and alive, and full of the particular noise of 10 million people getting on with their lives. Daniel looked up at the sky for a moment. Then he started walking toward the subway. He had a site meeting at 6:30. The first family moved into Unit 12 on a Thursday morning in August. Daniel was on the site when they arrived. He was always on the site, had been every day, for the better part of 2 years. And he watched from across the courtyard as a man in his 40s helped his mother-in-law up the front steps, while his wife carried a baby on her hip, and 2 older children ran ahead into the building, their voices echoing off the new walls. The Rivera family, 5 people who had been sharing a 2-bedroom apartment in the South Bronx with another family. 10 people total, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen the size of a closet. They had been on the city's affordable housing wait list for 6 years. Daniel stayed back. This wasn't a moment for the project director. This was a moment for the family. But the younger of the 2 children, a girl of about 8, in a yellow jacket, stopped at the entrance and turned around. She looked across the courtyard at Daniel, who was standing with his hard hat in his hand and his notebook under his arm. Did you build this? She called out. My team did, he called back. She considered this seriously. It's really nice, she said. Then she turned and ran inside after her brother. Daniel stood there for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook, turned around, and went back to work. Charlie Brennan and his family moved into Unit 31 3 weeks later. Charlie was 10 years old, with a gap between his front teeth and the focused, evaluating look of a child who takes everything seriously. His mother, Patricia, had worked as a hospital administrator for 12 years. His father, James, drove a city bus. They had been living in a 400-square-foot studio in Lower East Side. The 3 of them, paying $700 a month to a landlord who fixed nothing and raised the rent every year regardless. When Daniel handed Patricia Brennan the keys to their new apartment, she stood in the middle of the empty living room and didn't say anything for a long moment. She just looked at the light coming through the windows. The south-facing windows Daniel had fought to preserve in the design, the ones that would fill this room every afternoon from October through April. It's beautiful, she finally said in a voice that was trying very hard to stay even. I never really thought we'd have something like this. You should have had it a long time ago, Daniel said. Charlie had been moving through the apartment on his own private inspection tour. He came back into the living room and stood in front of Daniel with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to be indirect. Did you design this? He asked. I did. All of it? The windows and everything? All of it. Charlie nodded slowly, processing this. I want to be an architect, he said. When I grow up, I want to build places for people like us. Daniel looked at this boy, 10 years old, gap-toothed, completely certain, and felt something move in his chest that he didn't try to name. He reached into his notebook and took out a business card. He held it out. When you're ready to start thinking seriously about it, he said. Call me. I mean that. Charlie took the card with both hands, looked at it, put it carefully in the pocket of his jacket. I will, he said, like a promise. That night, Daniel sent his mother a photograph. Charlie Brennan standing in the doorway of his family's new apartment, grinning his gap-toothed grin, the afternoon light falling across the hallway behind him. Cecile's reply came within minutes. This is what building a legacy means. Well done, son. It was the first time she had called him that since Christmas night a year and a half ago. He read it 6 times. Then he set the phone down and sat quietly in his apartment for a while, letting it settle. The project finished on time. This was not something Daniel had taken for granted. There had been a wall collapse in May that had cost $35,000 from the contingency budget and 2 weeks of schedule. Had tried to substitute cheaper components. It had tried Tebert component and had been immediately dismissed. 3 separate permit complications that had required Linda Cooper's involvement to resolve. Every problem had been documented and reported to the Sullivan and Hayes Investment Committee at the monthly meetings that Cecile chaired with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. At the September committee meeting, the last one before the project's official completion, Cecile had reviewed his final report and then looked up and said, simply, "Good work, Daniel." 3 words. From her, in that room, they were worth more than any bonus. 120 units, 100% occupied before the official opening, 43 construction jobs created during the build. A neighborhood that had been written off now had a reason to look differently at what it could become. The numbers were in the report, but the numbers weren't what Daniel thought about when he thought about the project. He thought about the Rivera girl in the yellow jacket, about Charlie Brennan's business card disappearing into a jacket pocket like something precious, about Patricia Brennan standing in a room full of light saying, "I didn't really think we'd have something like this." He thought about his father's words, passed down through Frank Donovan, like something that had always been meant to reach him. Buildings aren't for impressing people. They're for people to live in with dignity. He understood now what it meant to build with that as the reason. In October, Cecile called him. Not a text through Robert. Not a message relayed through someone else. His phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon while he was reviewing drawings at the work table. Frank had given him in the Brooklyn office, and the screen said, "Mom." He picked up on the first ring. "Hello," he said. "Hello, Daniel." Her voice was clear and warm and entirely, recognizably hers, not the boardroom register, not the careful professional distance of the past year and a half, but simply her, the voice he had grown up with. "How are you?" "I'm good," he said. "I'm really good, actually. I know. Robert keeps me very well informed." A pause. "I wanted to ask you something. Anything. Would you come for dinner? Not a holiday, not an occasion, just dinner, next Sunday if you're free." He was quiet for a moment, not because he needed to think about it, but because the simplicity of it required a second to absorb. After everything, after 18 months of distance and growth and the long, difficult business of becoming someone different, just dinner. "Yes," he said. "I'll be there." "Good. Come at 6. I'll make Thomas's pot roast recipe. It takes all afternoon, and I always make too much." He almost said, "I've been learning to make pot roast too," Dorothy's recipe, from across the hall, but he saved it for Sunday. "I'll see you then," he said. "See you then," she said, and hung up. He sat at the work table for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he went back to the drawings because there was still work to do, and the afternoon was only half over. December 24th, 1 year and 1 day after Christmas. Cecile's apartment on the Upper West Side was filled with the smell of pot roast by 2 in the afternoon. It was a different kind of Christmas than the year before. 12 people instead of 25. No borrowed penthouse, no crystal glasses or catered impression of a life. Just Cecile's real apartment. 850 square feet of books and photograph, and the particular comfortable disorder of a place that was actually lived in. with mismatched chairs brought in from the bedroom to make room at the table, and the kind of plates that didn't match because they had been accumulated over years, rather than purchased as a set. Robert Hayes came with his wife. Linda Cooper brought wine and stayed to help set the table. Frank Donovan arrived with a bakery box of something that smelled like cinnamon. Eleanor came in a taxi from her apartment, moving more slowly than she used to, but with the same unbothered dignity she had always carried. Dorothy had been invited. Daniel's doing, and she arrived with a container of her homemade tomato soup as a starter, because she could not come to a dinner party without contributing something. And at 5:30, Patricia Brennan arrived with her husband, James, and Charlie, who was wearing a tie that was slightly too big for him and carrying something tucked under his arm. Charlie insisted on coming, Patricia said to Cecile at the door. He said Mr. Sullivan's mother was the reason he had a real room to do his homework in. Cecil looked at the boy. Is that right? She said. Charlie held out what he had been carrying under his arm. It was a drawing, done in colored pencils on a large sheet of drafting paper, clearly labored over, of a tall building with many windows, and, written above it in careful block letters, Hope. I drew this for you, he said, because you built it. Cecile took the drawing with both hands. She looked at it for a long moment. Thank you, Charlie, she said. This is going on my wall. He nodded, satisfied. He had delivered what he came to deliver. He went inside to find somewhere interesting to sit. Dinner was loud and warm and full of the kind of laughter that comes from people who are genuinely glad to be in the same room. Eleanor and Dorothy, who had never met before, discovered within 20 minutes that they had both grown up in the same neighborhood in the Bronx in the 1950s and spent most of the dinner trading memories of streets and shops and people that no longer existed. Frank told a story about Thomas on a construction site in 1998 that made Robert laugh so hard he had to put down his fork. Charlie ate 2 portions of pot roast and asked Robert 3 careful questions about how property management worked, which Robert answered with the seriousness the questions deserved. Daniel cooked. Not everything. Cecile had the pot roast well in hand, but the side dishes, the rolls he had learned to make from a recipe Dorothy had written out for him by hand, the apple pie he had practiced 4 times in the preceding 2 weeks until it was right. He moved around Cecile's small kitchen with the unhurried ease of someone who had spent the past 18 months learning that feeding yourself and the people you care about is not a minor skill, but a meaningful one. At one point, he and Cecile were both at the counter, her stirring the gravy, him slicing bread, and she glanced over at him. You've learned to cook, she said. My neighbor taught me, he said. Dorothy. The woman in the living room currently telling Uncle Robert about the old fish market on Arthur Avenue. Cecile looked through the doorway at Dorothy, who was gesturing with her wineglass and making Robert laugh. I like her, Cecile said. She's the reason I made it through January, Daniel said simply. Cecile nodded, understanding that January had been something to be made through. They worked side by side at the counter for a moment in comfortable silence. Mom, he said. I want to say something at dinner, before dessert. Is that all right? She looked at him. Of course it is. Thursday, after the pot roast, after the bread, after Frank's cinnamon pastries and Dorothy's soup and the wine Linda had chosen, Daniel stood up. The table went quiet. He didn't have anything prepared. He had thought about preparing something and then decided against it, because everything that needed to be said was real, and real things don't need preparation. A year ago, he began. At a Christmas dinner, I said the cruelest thing I have ever said to someone I love. I told my mother to pay rent in her own house, in front of 25 people, on Christmas. He didn't look away from Cecile. I said it because I had spent 3 years believing a story about myself that wasn't true. A story about a man who had built something on his own, who had earned everything he had, who didn't owe anything to anyone. He paused. That story was a lie, and I was the last person in the room to know it. No one spoke. Charlie Brennan was watching him with complete attention. My mother, Daniel continued, did something that I did not understand at the time and have spent the past year learning to understand. She didn't argue with me. She didn't explain herself. She didn't pull out a folder of documents and prove me wrong in front of everyone. She just let me fall. And in falling, I found out what I was actually made of, which turned out to be less than I thought, and also more than I knew. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out an envelope. I have been saving since January, he said. Every month. It took me 14 months, but this is every dollar that I spent on that credit card over 3 years. Every dinner, every hotel, everything, with interest. He set the envelope on the table, in front of Cecile. It's yours. It was always yours. Cecil looked at the envelope. The table was very still. Then she picked it up, and without opening it, she tore it in half. Cleanly, calmly. She set the two halves on the table. I don't want your money, she said. Her voice was quiet and clear and completely certain. I never wanted your money. I wanted your character. She looked at him. And that I can't put a price on. Daniel stood at his place at the table. He had promised himself he wasn't going to cry. He had been very firm with himself about this on the subway ride over. He crossed to his mother's end of the table. She stood, and he put his arms around her, and she put her arms around him, and for a long moment they just stood there, in the middle of her small real apartment, with the mismatched plates and the borrowed chairs, and Frank Donovan discreetly wiping his eyes, and Eleanor holding Dorothy's hand across the table, and Charlie Brennan watching with the serious, careful attention of someone who is filing everything away to understand later. When they separated, Cecile held his face in both hands the way she had when he was small. You did good, Daniel, she said. Just that. He nodded. He couldn't quite speak. He went back to his seat. The table erupted, not in the formal applause of a ceremony, but in the warm, slightly chaotic noise of people who are genuinely moved and expressing it in their own particular ways. Robert raised his glass. Frank said something that made Eleanor laugh. Dorothy said bravo in a firm voice, like a teacher giving a grade. Charlie leaned over to his mother and whispered something. Patricia listened, then nodded. Charlie looked back at Daniel. My mom says when I grow up, I should be like you, he announced. The table laughed. Don't be like me, Daniel said. Learn from my mistakes and do better. Charlie thought about this seriously. What was your biggest mistake? The table went slightly quiet, not uncomfortably, but with the attentiveness of people who genuinely wanted to hear the answer. Daniel looked at his mother, confusing what I was given with what I had earned, he said. They feel exactly the same from the inside. That's what makes it hard to see. Charlie nodded, processing. He picked up his fork. I'll remember that, he said, and went back to his pot roast, with the focused efficiency of a 10-year-old who has more important things to do than sit in feelings for too long. After the dishes were done and the guests had gone, Eleanor and Dorothy sharing a car home, Robert and his wife walking south toward the subway, Frank carrying his empty bakery box and the last of the wine. Daniel helped Cecile put the kitchen back in order. They worked quietly. She washed. He dried. The radio played softly from the counter, something instrumental and unhurried. The project, Daniel said after a while. What about it? It's done. 120 units. Frank has offered me a partnership in his firm. There are also some other conversations happening about the next phase. He set a pot in the drying rack. I don't know yet what I want. Cecil passed him a bowl without looking up from the sink. What does your heart want? Not the options, not what makes sense on paper. What do you actually want? He thought about it honestly. I want to keep doing work that matters, he said. I want to be near you. I feel like I spent 35 years not really knowing who you are, and I'd like to change that. He paused. And I want to be involved in whatever comes next for the company, not as your son, but as someone who can actually contribute something real to it. Cecil was quiet for a moment. Sullivan and Hayes is expanding its social impact division, she said, in the careful, neutral voice she used when she was being a businesswoman and a mother at the same time. We need someone to lead it. Someone who understands not just the architecture and the finance, but the reason behind the work. She handed him another dish. The salary is fair. No special treatment. You report to Robert on the operational side and to the full committee on the investment side. You succeed or fail entirely on the merits. He took the dish. And dinner? He said. She looked at him. Once a week, he said. No business. Just us. I have a lot of years to catch up on. She was quiet for a moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the thing that comes just before one. That, she said, is the best offer you've made all year. She passed him the last pot. He dried it, set it on the counter. They stood side by side at the sink in the warm, quiet kitchen, the radio playing, the city going on outside the window the way it always did. And Daniel thought about two people in a studio apartment in Queens 50 years ago, count money into a metal box under the bed, dreaming something that seemed impossible and building it anyway. He thought about what it meant to inherit that. Not the buildings, not the portfolio, not the $38 million. The stubbornness, the patience, the willingness to do the work when no one was watching and no one was keeping score. That was what they had actually built. And now, finally, standing in his mother's kitchen on Christmas night, the dishes done, the table cleared, 12 people having eaten together and meant it, he understood that he was part of it. Not because he had been born into it, because he had earned his way back. And that's where Cecile's story ends. Or at least, that's where her email to me ended, at 1 a.m. on a Wednesday in October, with dishes being washed, with a radio playing, with her son beside her. I've been thinking about how to close this out, and I keep coming back to something Eleanor said to Daniel in that hospital room, when he asked her what to do, when he was at his lowest and had nothing left to hold on to. She said, "Learn what your mother was trying to teach you from the beginning, the real value of things, what it takes to build something, the difference between having a privilege and deserving it. That's it. That's the whole lesson, really. And I think it applies to all of us, not just to people whose mothers own real estate companies, not just to people who've had dramatic Christmas dinners, because most of us at some point have been on one side or the other of this story. Some of us are Cecile. We love someone so much that we keep absorbing the cost of their comfort quietly without asking for acknowledgement, until the cost becomes something we can barely carry. And we tell ourselves it's love. And it is love. But it's love that has gotten confused about what its job is. Love's job is not to protect people from difficulty. Love's job is to make people capable of facing difficulty. Those are not the same thing. And when we forget the difference, even with the best intentions in the world, we could spend years building a beautiful, comfortable prison for the people we care most about. And some of us are Daniel, moving through life inside a story that flatters us, accepting things without examining where they came from or what they actually cost, measuring ourselves against an image rather than against our own honest effort. The thing about that kind of life is, it feels completely real from the inside. That's not an excuse, but it is important to understand. Daniel wasn't a bad person. He was a person who had never been required to look clearly at the distance between what he was given and what he had earned, and nobody had ever loved him clearly enough to require it of him, until his mother did. And the way she did it, quietly, without drama, with a suitcase packed on Christmas night, and the willingness to let everything come apart so that something real could be built in its place. That is one of the bravest things I've ever heard of a mother doing, because it would have been so much easier to stay, to keep the peace, to keep serving dinner, to keep paying the credit card statements, and telling herself that one day he would figure it out on his own. She knew he wouldn't, and she loved him too much to let him not. I want to ask all of you something before we close today. Is there someone in your life, a child, a grandchild, a partner, a friend, someone you've been loving in a way that's making it easier for them not to grow? Not because you're trying to hold them back, but because the alternative, letting them face real consequences, watching them struggle, saying the hard thing instead of the comfortable one, feels too painful to choose? I'm not saying the answer is always to do what Cecile did. Cecile's situation was specific and extreme and required the particular response she gave it. But the underlying question she was finally asking herself, am I helping this person become who they're capable of being? Or am I just making it easier for them to stay who they are? That question belongs to all of us. It's not an easy question. It doesn't have an easy answer. But it is, I think, one of the most important questions that love ever asks. Cecile Sullivan asked it on Christmas night at 67 years old, standing in front of a closet mirror with a half-packed suitcase. It's never too late to ask it. And if you're watching this today and you recognize yourself somewhere in this story, whether you're the one who's been giving too much without being seen, or the one who's been receiving without looking closely enough at the cost, I hope this story is useful to you. I hope it gives you something to think about. That's why Cecile wanted it told. Not so people would feel sorry for her. Not so Daniel would be seen as a villain who redeemed himself. But so that someone, somewhere, watching this, might recognize something true about the people they love and the way they love them, and might decide to do something about it. Thank you for spending this time with Cecile's story. And thank you, as always, for being here. Take good care of yourself.